Helen of Fourgates by Ethel Carnie, Book 2, Chapter 9, Snow. Across the barren purity of the snow-covered moor, with above it the wide-open eye of the solitary sky, the wind made that whinny of unutterable sadness, which is born of its having nothing to wrestle with. The earth bobs, the runnels between the bents, the tufts of fine blood-tinted grasses overhanging dark water-holes, the mounds tossed up by the moles, all were covered by that shroud that is as the symbol of sanctity to the ascetic. Under it were furze bushes, their gold ready to shoot sunlight pomp on the face of the world. All that was seen of them now was a bloomless jag here and there, pricking through the snow at its thinnest fold, like cypress bloom in a winding sheet. It was one vast blinding track of whiteness. No footprints lay upon it, save those made by the feet of moorfowl, or the dragging of their wings as they had flown low across it, or the soft indents of the pads of a baby hare's feet born in these wilds of March on this height of desolation. Across the monotony of the sky a hawk went, its wing like the sail of a ship forlorn on an ashen sea. It was even as a world where the foot of man had never been, whilst ever, seeking vainly for something to struggle with, the wind wandered, crying. Into the desert of grey sky-space projected the corblestones, ebon dark. No snow clung to their smooth, age-worn surfaces, but gaps between them were filled with it in man-high drifts. Far below those black figures, dumb lookers down on the muted valley, the trees in distance, dwindled field and hedgerow, were sheeted phantoms, and away in the unbroken whiteness that might smite the onlooker with a sense of ice ages gone by, the reservoir was black. It was hard to think that life had ever pulsated here, or would again. The hill stair by which Martin Scott had ascended to the moor on the night of his dream, by the little cradle-shaped pool, could now have been climbed by no human foot. It was sheet ice. Thaw winds blowing at intervals had brought streams of snow water over the sharp moor edge, only to freeze them into icy-cold daggers. The valley path was abandoned by the cautious. Snowslides from the heights were feared. As across the moor, so the valley below the stones showed no human footprints. If such had been, they were now covered up by the last downfall. In a drift, the board of a farmer's cart thrust itself through the snow like the prow of a foundering bark, and upon it might have been read the name of one Edward Tripp, farmer of Cowle Moor Farm. Under that virgin snow were likewise buried lambing sheep, overtaken by the blizzard in the dead of night. In those shrouded trees were the deserted half-built nests of birds who had travelled overseas, restless to reach one little lane in the wide world, maybe one bush or tree in this now lost valley. Life and hope had sunk under this polar purity, and the wildness of the overhanging heights, with what Lizzie Tripp termed their God-forsaken look, was indeed something to make the timid shudder. Yet, toiling through the lonely vale, naked of growth, empty of sound, save for that low, tired intermezzo of the wind, was a human figure, its garments sombre against the snow. Occasionally it paused, as if looking behind and before, then up at the stones, with some sense of freedom in the sight of these uninhabited wastes of snow and silence. Then it would come on again, dodging the drifts. Something in the way the snow was flung up again after each step, and in the sagging of its garments on the powdery carpet, suggested its being a woman. Her appearance on the dumb and barren aspect of the vale lent to her a tragic loneliness, with something of dignity borrowed from the gloomy heights above and from the whole scene she wandered in. She had the appearance of a wanderer, rather than of one who travelled to any given place. But when she paused, looking backwards, as if to measure the distance behind her, it might be said that something of melancholy pleasure tinged that pale face, as if she wandered away from, if not towards, some definite object or place. She advanced until she reached the gate that looked upon an upland field. Against the white crest of this hill field, a ghost of a moon flickered one light through the ashen sky. In the smooth snow of the upland were footprints extending from a cote in the middle way of it, near a little farm. Leaning against the gate, the woman surveyed the marks of these human feet leading to the farm, with an expression of weariness amounting almost to distrust. From over the hill crest came the barking of dogs. She looked back along the path she had traversed, then at the heights above. There was a wistfulness in her glance, as though, were it possible, she would never again turn into the haunts of men. Wanner than ever in its moon-pale charm, with the hood of the same old cloak drawn over her dusky hair, it was the face of Helen Day, wife of the now locally famous Fielding Day. It was scarcely changed, save for a subtle restless grave that had gone out of the eyes. The old expression of the face now had in it an almost inhuman remoteness from ordinary life. If asked to define that expression, a psychologist would have been baffled to say wherein lay its power of fascination. Sweetness it had none. It was hard, chill, pallid, with a soullessness that repulsed and attracted. This face upturned to the spectral moon hanging in the oppressive sky. Its beauty was stone-like, but it was a beauty haunting in its elusiveness. After a few minutes by the gate, she put out her hand, unasping a rusted chain. The sound of the chain startled a hen and a brood. The startled mother hustled her chicks towards the cote, and, watching the picture, a dim misery passed over the stoicism of the woman at the gate, like mist over an ice peak. Fastening the chain hurriedly, as one who chains down her mind, at the same time fastening up some dreadful thought within it, she passed into the field, walking straight ahead, edging as far as possible from the farm. But it was all in vain. The bright eyes of little Aggie Tripp had spied her. They disappeared quickly from the window pane. The farm door opened, dogs barked, and Lizzie, blue-aproned, bare-armed, almost crushing in her matronliness, with Aggie's curly head at her stout waistline, called across the interspace of snow, a note of reproach in her northern burr, "Helen Mason, and pass in our door." There was no answer to that hurt surprise but to advance to meet her as she crossed the farmyard, with its snow-swathed outbuildings and lean-tos. At the gate they looked into each other's eyes, Helen's with that shrinking in them that might be interpreted as some wild longing to escape from human inspection. "Thou needn't say thou were turning in," said Lizzie bluntly. "If Aggie hadn't seen thee, tha'd ha' gone by. Happen we're not class enough, seeing thy husband. Thou sees we follow the world if we're out on it. We've seen his picture in Brungley News last week, and then thee trying to get past our door." Helen smiled. Her smile and the clear look of it were sufficient answer to Lizzie's suspicion. The latter was convinced that whatever madness had made Helen turn to those lone snows rather than a cup of tea and chat in a cosy farm kitchen, it was not that of snobbishness. There had always been a good deal she had taken for granted in Helen Mason. Helen followed Lizzie into the black-raftered kitchen, full of rosy lights on polished steel and on shining pewter vessels that hung on the old-fashioned wall shelves, whilst the smell of nettle beer a-brewing and bread in the baking filled every nook and cranny. Before the fire was Aggie's baby chair, now too small for her, but holding the dilapidated form of a wooden doll that stared crazily into the caverns of the fire. Aggie took Helen's cloak and made her smile faintly by stroking the silk dress, now unveiled, with reverent touch. Lizzie set a chair near to the fire. "It's hot enough here," said Helen, taking Teddy's chair in the shadowy ingle-nook. "How do I like living here?" sniffed Lizzie contemptuously, in answer to a query from Helen. "Deeing here, that means. I would tell like burying alive, but that doesn't know. Nobody can know till they come to it. Nowt to see but them great black stones. Flace 'em as if they were sitting in judgment, and to see a bird go up sky and wish tha'd wings to be back in Fourgates, and nowt but sound of wind and water, and when that thunderstorm were on Helen, this valley reminded me o' hell, like what hell might be, that black and dismal. Why folks ever leaves Fourgates is a mystery to me, but a bigger is how they can go and ne'er come back. Helen looked at her as she slapped a lump of dough into shape with a plump hand. "Thou doesn't know what it is to be lonesome," said Lizzie. "Thou never lived away from Fourgates." "No," said Helen, a small pale smile hovering around her mouth. "I've never been away from Fourgates." "And how's thy father?" asked Lizzie. "Has he gotten his use back yet? I shouldn't have thought he'd have had a stroke." "He can trail hisself across the floor to the window and back again to his chair in the nook, and that's about all," answered the woman in the corner. "His speech is a bit twisted like, but he makes me understand, and it's as good as having hands and feet almost, to have field, for he does all for him that he can't do for hisself." Again that pale smile flickered round her mouth. She was staring down at a blue mark on the back of her hand, a mark half hidden by the shadow of a cunningly arranged frilling of black net. "It's nice when it's like that," said Lizzie, a sort of son to him. "Aggie, get me that fork to prick this cake of thy dad's, or he'll think it's noan reet. His mother always pricked 'em like this, 3 little fork marks, just to let the witches out, and so we go on pricking 'em, though nobody believes in witchcraft now." She set Teddy's cake on one side, then looked up swiftly. "There's a letter there against clock on th' dresser, Helen. Happen they'll like to see it, sin' it's from an old friend of thine. Teddy and me thowt Martin had nigh forgotten there were a place on th' map at world called Fourgates, or else that he'd ta'en some mack of spite again it. Just reach and read it, for my hands aren't fit for flour. Sin' he writ Teddy when he'd been landed in America a month, and sends back the brass he'd borrowed, we'd ne'er had a wimp on him, and there's not much in that letter. Not a wimp o' whether he's wed and worried yet. No but asking if Teddy could let him have enough brass to bring him back to Fourgates, and that it's a matter of life and death, and if Teddy can't, but there, reach it." Helen sat looking at Lizzie. Through the chill remoteness of her look flashed another for a moment, but it was gone so quickly that Lizzie did not see it. She was stirring milk into a sweet loaf for Sunday, when she expected visitors from her beloved Fourgates. "Get it," she repeated. "He didn't say we hadn't to show anybody, and he wouldn't mind these seeing it anyhow. Aye, that's it." Helen had risen and was crossing over to the dresser. She had reseated herself, opening the letter out, Lizzie's spoon clicking, and her comments made a running stream of sound, to which Helen read. "Aye, and him used to be so proud," puffed Lizzie. "Aggie, open th' oven door for thy feyther's cake. But I know I could go on my knees, my bare bended knees, to ask him to get back to Fourgates. But as for Teddy going to ask that priest he mentioned on Aggie, why, of course that's brunt thee. Here, shut that blubbering, I'll put the green salve on it." Whilst Lizzie was salvaging Aggie's burn, Helen was reading the letter. She broke up a cob on the fire to get sufficient light. As the flames leapt up, she looked not unlike the wild-eyed girl who had sat in the red autumnal wood, with the dead leaves swirling about her as she drew to her the soul of an invisible man, setting upon him the spell that should bind him to her, though he fled to the uttermost corners of the earth. He was coming back. Martin Scott was coming back to Fourgates. He was coming back as she had willed it, that he should come back on that storm-riven day. He was coming back, beaten. She also was beaten, wrecked. The big tides that had washed him out from Fourgates had not been able to keep him, to make him forget. He also was wrecked. He must get the money, be able to come back. She wanted to see him, the man who had thought he had only to get away, to leave Fourgates behind him forever. The fool who had held her in the hollow of his hand and flung her away, anywhere, to anyone. The coward who had kissed her and left her. He had taken the way he had thought, without responsibility, without risk, and he had to beg Teddy Tripp to send in the money to bring him back, a burning crave written between the reserved brevity of his letter. "What's to think on it?" asked Lizzie, fixing the staring doll in the arms of the sobbing Aggie to console her for the smart of the burn. "Will Teddy lend him the brass?" asked Helen. "Teddy can't," said Lizzie austerely, "for he's got none to lend. It's all gone in this farm he's dreamed of so long, always talking of a farm on the slope of her hill, and gotten it, and all our bit of brass swallowed up, so it's no use Martin looking to us, and as for Teddy running after that old priest on strength of his remembering Martin, if Teddy couldn't spare the brass, well, Teddy said it's the craziest thing he ever heard. Martin mun have changed." With which she opened the oven door, popped Teddy's cake in, slammed the door to, and sat down, her broad back to the window, her face shadowed, but her eyes glinting as she looked across at Helen. Aggie was sobbing in an undertone now. The wooden doll was comforting her. There was silence then, save for the loud tick of the clock, the fall of a cinder on the snowy hearth, the crackling sound of Teddy's cake in the oven, and from without the sound of the wind over the snow. Lizzie moved restlessly in her seat, then leaned forwards. The sheen of the fine gold chain round the neck of the woman in the dusky silk dress held her glance, and seemed to give her courage. "Thy father never paid Martin them wages from that day to this, I believe," she observed. "Nor ever will," said the woman in the ingle, "not if he waits till Judgment Day. Dead robbery, I call it," said Lizzie. "Martin should have waited till my father came home and paid him," said Helen. "He'll not get it now, unless he goes to law." Whilst the bare supposition of a man who had to borrow money to get back to Fourgates going to law with a wealthy farmer made Lizzie shake her head with a "Nay, he'll no and go to law, but I thought, aye, there's some thinks because my father has had a stroke, or it would soften his heart, but that would never soften, though his marrow ran away. He's harder nor ever now. Nobody'll stick cannels round him and make out he'd deed sorry for this or for that. He isn't the sort they made tracks on." Helen's eyes met Lizzie's squarely. Despite herself, the latter's silhouette against the window drooped disappointedly. "Well," she said philosophically, "if he'll not, he'll not. And now put it down on the table, I'll put it in the dresser again. And now tell us all news of Fourgates." The telling did not take long, not even with the inclusion of the sow that had had a record litter, of Andre the weaver being about to summons the new brewery people for pouring stuff into his stream that made his hens drunk every Monday morning, and of his being about to take a drunken hen as chief witness to Brungley Old Court. During the recital Lizzie listened with a holy look. She wiped her eyes on the corner of her apron as one moved by some religious ecstasy. Then, the tear and smile still lingering in her eye, she looked round the corner of her apron at Helen. "Hasn't ta left summat out?" she asked, with tender slyness. She saw Aggie leaning against Helen, and called her off with more sharpness than the occasion seemed to warrant. "And tak that bucket and fill it," she commanded. "They're well frozen? Well, that be yesterday, mayhap it's thawed now, and let's have no back answers." Thus admonished, Aggie set out across the snow with her bucket. Helen was sitting somewhat rigidly in the corner. There was an alertness almost painful in the dark eyes. The shadows had not woven a kindly obscurity over her face, a strange shrinking look, almost akin to one of shame, a spiritual shuddering from hearing something she dreaded, cried aloud upon the public air. "Teddy stopped to talk with Andre about his sow littering," began Lizzie again, taking up the thread of conversation with an assumption of being casual. "Aye, that very day his cart stuck in drift yon on way back. Andre's wife came out as they barged, and she gave him a whimper news, and I says to him as he sat where they sits now, 'Teddy Tripp, Helen had a told me, I'm sure, and how should Andre's wife know? But the next time I see Helen, I'll ask her.'" "Aye," said Helen. There was something as antagonistic in her tone as on her face. The sound of it seemed to fluster Lizzie. Andrew's wife said, began Lizzie. Then she broke off. The silence of the woman in the corner was embarrassing. Lizzie rose and walked over to where Helen sat, stood before her, looking down at her in a tender, searching way. Their shadows on the wall stirred. From a snow-covered field at the back of the farm came the shrill cry of a curlew. Lizzie stood smiling in that tender, motherly fashion. Helen's hands gripped the chair arms that were dented with Teddy cutting up his tobacco. Her face was alabaster white, her eyes had darkened in their old way when excited. It's true, Helen? Asked Lizzie. Aye, answered Helen. Thou'll get through, cheered Lizzie. That's strong. Aye, said the woman in the chair. It's a wonderful thing, said Lizzie. A child born of two folk as love. Helen smiled. A soul in torment might have smiled so. Lizzie was too taken up with the news to notice. When? She asked softly. In the fall, answered Helen. She was staring drearily into the fire at a coffin-shaped coal. A little beyond it appeared to be a miniature wood, and when the wind blew down the wide chimney, red leaves were falling there. Falling, falling, even as they had fallen around her when she had cast her spell on the wet wind, so that she had fancied it would meet Martin, whichever way he tried to escape her. Lizzie's lips were moving, her plump fingers counting against her apron. There were visions in her eyes. Next year at this time, she said, it'll be after feeling its feet. We couldn't hold Aggie at that age. It'll happen, Dee, said Helen. The icy drip of those few words caused Lizzie Tripp to start back. Helen, she gasped. She poked up the fire again to see that shadow-veiled face. In every line of it was stamped loathing, a sense of degradation. The eyes stared wild and black. Isn't there any way out? Helen had risen from her chair and stood up. In her black attire with dead white face, she seemed some outraged goddess. Her words stabbed at the air. From without came the sobbing of the wind over the snow, and between it came fragments of Rock-a-Bye Baby in Aggie's treble, with that thin, sad thread of the curlew's cry filtering through it. Helen, thee! Ejaculated Lizzie, and flopped into a chair. There was silence. Then Lizzie said, as one thinking of a scene beyond a scene, Thou'rt not poor. Some of her ruddy colour had paled a little. A cinder dropping made her start nervously. It isn't like you hardly knew how to keep a roof o'er your heads and hadn't a rag to wrap it in, she said, or as if it were a bastard. It's a bastard, avowed Helen tonelessly, a real bastard, gotten in loathing, growing in loathing, and it'll see it writ on my face. Those they call bastards are holy compared with it. Jesus Christ's mother couldn't show no marriage lines when she went to thin, but this, me, to come to this, a bastard thrust on me, and to have it put in papers, and a presentation, maybe, and all time to know it comes into the world lower than a dog, because I'm again it all time, to struggle to give it life, when it's him, all him, and none of me, and to hate it more for that, though it should make me love it more, if it hadn't been a tally husband. Her voice trailed off into mute misery. Lizzie stared, dumbfounded. But you're wed, she said feebly. Folk think so, said Helen, like they'll think it isn't a bastard. Lizzie shook her head hopelessly. Helen had a half-mad look to her. I've nowt to wrap it in, said Helen, thinking of Lizzie's past words, not a rag of love to welcome its limbs. I'm giving it every drop of blood with a grudge, and then try its hands fumbling and creeping round my breast, and it's smiling up in my face with his eyes, maybe, whilst every cell in my body shrinks away from it, or I'm clay cold to it, me, to ha' come to this. If I hated a man ever so, said Lizzie, I couldn't but love a little innocent child when it sucked me. Helen laughed. My father didn't bring me up like a little turtle dove, she said, and I'd no saints with leeks round their heads and faces like they'd no blood. but there are some women like their men because they happen to be Charles' father. Sung it t'other way wi' me, and made the other way somehow, always t'other way, running after what should run after me, running away from what I should run to. I feel like creeping into a dark hole and never coming out again, like I were disgrace. All these years dreaming and growing, and the fruit's a bastard. I can't face it, Lizzie. Tell us." She had thrown out her hands before her, as if to ward off some terror. From outside came Aggie's joyous voice singing, "All in a row, gathering snow. Some said yes, and some said no." Lizzie rose from her chair and went towards the cupboard. "Teddy's cake's burning," said Helen. "Shall I take it out?" Lizzie nodded, climbing upon a chair to reach that top shelf. From the duskiest corner of it she took down a canister. Her colour was still pale with the gust of some old pain. Teddy's cake was clean gone from her mind. She marvelled that Helen should think of it. "It's spoilt," said that black-robed woman. "Ne'er mind," answered Lizzie. "Light that candle, Helen," she said, climbing down, "and ne'er mind scraping cake." Helen obeyed. The candle shed its lustre on the two heads bent over the open canister, and upwards on the two pale faces, one quivering as with a backward look, the other proud and firm. Once Lizzie looked into that countenance with shuddering wonder. "Aren't I flayed? Hast a no conscience?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "I mustn't have been there when they gave 'em out," answered Helen. "Ginger cake," said Lizzie, tossing an old paper away after a second scrutiny. Helen picked it up. "There's summat on back," she said, and then read out her name and address. "That's it," said Lizzie. Then she sat down by the table. "It's a long way to Thorn," she observed. "They'll not go today, and it's darting for more snow." "I'll go today," said Helen. "I suppose she'll live there yet." "She were there a year back," said Lizzie, "but I've not seen her for that day to this. Billy were 20 last Thursday, and he were only a babby then, just walking. 'Twere to save his life I went to see old Betty at Thorn, and I hoped 'twouldn't be written against me being so. The doctor said he'd fade away if he hadn't nourishment, and if I didn't keep at mill I couldn't get 'em, and I ne'er could keep there when I were carrying me childer. And then Teddy lost his work, and 'twere just a draught of 2 herbs." A pause, then she said shakily, "'Twould have been a lad." Her voice died away. She was staring at the candle flame with a drawn look on her naturally plump face. Her hand was beating a restless tattoo on the table. "She'll be nigh on 80, she said after a moment's silence, "and I expect she'll be above ground, for such like don't dee soon, them as traffics wi' devil. For she said she'd witch it back into neat again, and them herbs that she gave me ne'er grew it sunlight, I'm sure." Helen smiled sceptically and got up to put on her cloak. When she was fastening it, the door opened and Aggie tumbled in. Her hair was white with snow. She'd been lying down in a field, she said, to make the shape of herself. Then she ran and picked up her doll from the chair. "You've never looked at my babby," she said, with a matronliness quaint and touching. "When I get 21 years old I'll have a real one, instead of a ring like Glen got when it was her birthday." Helen smiled. "What is she called?" she asked gravely. "Helen," said Aggie. "Mr. Scott brought her me from Bungley before I went away in big ship." She began to sing and croon to it. Lizzie followed Helen to the door. The wind was blowing more wildly now. Sometimes it raised a ghost-like curtain of snow over the landscape. "They'll let me know?" asked Lizzie. "Aye," answered Helen, drawing her hood more closely over her brow. Then she said, looking at Lizzie, "Thanks." Lizzie drew back. "Look," she said, and pointed to a signpost which stated that trespassers would be prosecuted. A single magpie, ink black against a snowy background, was perched on the pole. As they looked, he flew over the wastes of snow. "An else sign," shuddered Lizzie. Helen laughed. "It's iller to be beaten," she said, and set her head towards Thorn, walking swiftly over the snow. There was somewhere to go to now, to Thorn, to that desolate hamlet where Martin had spent his unhappy childhood, near the wide wild moss where he had watched the hawks travel across the sky. After 2 miles, during which the afternoon light had waned considerably, she came to the meeting of 2 roads. A vehicle came along one of these. She waited. "Want a lift?" queried the driver. "Aye, Thorn way," answered Helen. "I'm going that way," he began, then hesitated. "I can pay," said the woman in the cloak. "It isn't that," he said. A short conversation took place between him and someone within the coach. "Let her get in," said a clear voice at length. "Let her get in." Helen climbed up into the dimness of the old coach. "Cold travelling weather," said that peculiarly penetrating voice from the furthest corner. "And Thorn is a wild place." Helen saw white hair under a black cassock, a long, thin, pale face with a pair of intense eyes, and from the blackness of the priestly gown she saw 2 thin, tapering hands in restless motion. They might have been trying to catch invisible birds, or perhaps they were only chafing against the cold. "I'm going to see a friend," said Helen. Even as she spoke she had a sense of doing so against her will, and drew further into her corner, where she looked out on a backward vista of the cobblestones. "I know every soul in Thorn," said the voice. "What did you say your friend's name was?" "I didn't say," said Helen, her eyes meeting his, now that he might see she was no fool. "But she's called Haggis, Betty Haggis." The old priest came out of his corner and seated himself opposite to her now. The full light from the coach window was on his face, that remarkable face, eaten up by the intensity of those eyes. Helen remembered that she had seen him once when walking with Martin in a Four-Gates lane, and how Martin had told her, as he caught up with her after talking to the priest, that he had been after catching his soul. This was Martin's priest. This was the man who had taught him about those pallid saints with their halos, the saints who had raised themselves on Martin's side against her and the red earth and the lawless winds and the spirits of the moors and the cloughs. The old man's hands were clutching and unclutching in their restless way. He leaned across the coach looking at the strong face. "Then you'll be sorry to hear that your friend died last night," he said. "I gave her sacrament. Perhaps it is now no good your going to Thorn." Helen half rose from her seat. "No," she said, "I must get back to Four-Gates." "There is a road a little further on leads straight there," said the priest. "Yes, I will stop the coach when we reach it." "Four-Gates, did you say? Four-Gates?" His eyes seemed to scan some mental register. At length he lit up with a fiercer glow. "Then you might know Martin Scott," he said. "Aye, that is, the church has lost sight of him for some time, but she never forgets. No, she never forgets. She is like a woman who has once loved and held. She waits. Do you know Martin? Is he there still? I should be glad if you would bear me a message to him." "He left Four-Gates 3 years since," said Helen. "Went abroad. He has no money and wants to get back." "Do you remember his address?" asked the priest. Helen gave it. It was stamped on her brain from seeing it on the letter. "You have a good memory," smiled the priest, taking it down. It was a long address. "Like the church," she smiled back at him. He looked at her intently. "You are not—" he began eagerly. "No, I don't belong to you," she said rudely. "You would have bricked me up alive a bit back, burnt me or hung me. Your saints, they've no blood. I'd rather have the smell of a moor clod than your incense, or a body smell from an old clout of a coat. I don't like your saints with their pale faces. They look tired and they blaspheme so. If I'm not to be happy, I'll not pretend. But you might get Martin back. I should think you would be almost sure." She rose to her feet. The mocking pagan smile met the eyes of the old priest. "Thank you," he said, as if she had given him something. He was folding up the leaf he had written on. "I shall write, Mr. Scott. Perhaps I could mention your name." "He would scarcely know it," she smiled. "We are almost strangers. I just happen to know where he is and that he wants to come back. In small places folk know all about, even if they don't know each other. Then she got out as the coach was stopped at the road leading to Foregates. When she reached the village it was pitch dark, but along the road, lit by the fitful light of a lantern, a flock of sheep were being driven along to Brungerley, to the slaughterer. The red lights of the farm greeted her, shining down the hillside on a swell of snow. Creeping up to the window, she peered into the kitchen. Fielding Day was bent over his boots at the table, the red globe lamp beside him making his wolfish look more keen. Old Mason was in the bed brought down into the kitchen for him since his stroke. "Thou gives her too much string, Field," she heard him growl in his twisted way. Fielding Day looked up across at the clock, then at the figure on the bed. "String," he snarled. "I'll string her. When she comes, I'll—" Then he bent over his boots again, his lips moving as he counted. "Hey!" The twisted laugh of her father came to the woman outside, the woman who, following on after that flock of bleating sheep, had decided with primitive loathing or with weariness that the gods were too much for her, that she could not set her hand against anything so helpless as an unborn child. Her father, Fielding, Martin, the gods, these she could fight, the fierce, but a child. She pressed the latch down noiselessly and was in upon them before they were aware. "I've come," she announced, smiling. Day snapped his boots together. He was weary of struggling with unfeeling figures. The light of battle was in his eyes. He had that half laugh on his countenance which, with the whiteness of his teeth, made him so like a wolf at times. "Aye," he said, straightening himself up. "So I say. Well, come in. Don't be flayed." "Flayed?" she laughed, and advanced into the middle of the kitchen. Fielding Day stood watching her as she leisurely took off her cloak, watching and waiting, like something about to spring.